Look around you. Everything you buy, every debt you owe, every wage you earn, it is all denominated in a currency issued by one entity. In the United States, that entity is the Federal Reserve. Most people believe the Fed is a government institution. They think it was created by Congress to stabilize the economy, to protect your savings, and to act as a neutral arbiter of American prosperity. They believe the chairman of the Federal Reserve answers to the president, and that the money they print is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. But what if every single one of those assumptions was fundamentally, tragically wrong? What if the creation of the Federal Reserve was not a heroic act of public service, but a carefully orchestrated maneuver, a coup dictate against the American people's financial sovereignty, engineered by the very banking elite it was supposedly designed to regulate? This isn't just history. It's the story of how the most powerful, least understood financial cartel in the world met in absolute secrecy, plotted to create a system that guaranteed their permanent control over credit, and then sold that system to the American public as an act of patriotism. The Federal Reserve is called the lender of last resort. But by the end of this film, you will know the terrifying truth. It is the creator of first debt. It is the entity that simultaneously controls the money supply and profits directly from the nation's perpetual debt. The year is 1910. The location is a remote, exclusive hunting club off the coast of Georgia. And the 6 men who meet there are about to change the fate of the world, in a secret so deep they swore to never speak of it. Their goal, to end the financial independence of the United States forever. Stay with us, because the story you're about to hear is the true origin story of the endless cycle of debt, inflation, and financial crises that defines your life today. To understand the why, we have to go back further, to the decades preceding 1910. The late 19th and early 20th centuries in America were defined by 2 things: industrial growth on a scale never before seen, and crushing, terrifying financial panics. The U.S. had tried central banking before. Both the first and second banks of the United States were met with fierce public and political opposition, epitomized by President Andrew Jackson's famous war against the second bank in the 1830s. Jackson rightly saw the power of a private banking monopoly as incompatible with a free republic, declaring, "You are a den of vipers and thieves." After Jackson destroyed the second bank, America entered an era known as the national banking system, characterized by thousands of independent banks and, critically, an inelastic currency. In times of prosperity, money was plentiful. But when a shock hit, a bad harvest, a railroad collapse, there was no mechanism to inject emergency liquidity. Banks would hoard what cash they had, leading to immediate credit contraction, bank runs, and catastrophic economic depressions. In the fall of 1907, the collapse of a major trust company in New York triggered widespread panic. The government was paralyzed. Who stepped in? Not the Treasury, but one man, J.P. Morgan. Morgan, alongside other powerful New York financiers, locked the city's leading bankers in his library, strong-arming them into pooling capital to bail out the system. He was the de facto central bank, personally deciding which institutions lived and which died. This event was a revelation to the powerful banking interests. It proved 2 things. The system was too unstable to continue, constantly threatening their amassed wealth. The American public would accept any solution, no matter how extreme, as long as it promised stability. The time was right. The problem was clear. The solution, a central bank, was known. But how do you sell a European-style central bank, which Americans historically despised as an instrument of control, to a fiercely independent democracy? The answer was deception. They needed a reform plan, but it couldn't come from Wall Street. It had to come from Congress. The National Monetary Commission was formed, led by Senator Nelson Aldrich, a Republican from Rhode Island. Crucially, Aldrich was known to be closely connected to the big financial interests. He was John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s father-in-law. In late 1910, Aldrich, ostensibly traveling to study European central banks, detoured to a place where no reporter, no politician, and no public inquiry could ever reach them: Jekyll Island. Under the guise of a duck hunting trip, 6 men boarded a private rail car using only their first names: Nelson, Paul, Frank, Henry, Piet, and Arthur. These were not just men. They represented the absolute pinnacle of American finance. Senator Aldrich, Paul Warburg, Kuhn, Loeb and Co., Frank Vanderlip, president of Rockefeller's National City Bank, Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Co. DeGuercy, and others. For 9 days, in absolute secrecy, they drafted a piece of legislation that would fundamentally restructure the American financial system. They didn't just propose a solution. They designed a financial machine that would grant them perpetual power under the convincing guise of government oversight. The only remaining question was, could they make Congress believe it was for the people? What emerged from the Jekyll Island meeting was the Aldrich Plan. It was a blueprint for a single, powerful, National Reserve Association. Essentially a centralized bank run almost entirely by private banking interests. Paul Warburg, the German-born banking partner, was the architect. Having seen European central banking firsthand, he understood how to mask private control under a public facade. The core decisions made on Jekyll Island were tactical and brilliant. Deception of decentralization. The bank would not be a single central bank like the Bank of England. It would be a system of regional banks, 12 of them, creating the illusion of dispersed local control, appealing to populist American distrust of Wall Street. Private ownership. The regional Federal Reserve banks would be owned by their member commercial banks. This meant the private banks, like Morgan's and Rockefeller's, would own the lender of last resort. Monopoly on currency. It would grant the system the sole right to issue Federal Reserve notes, our current paper money, replacing the previously diverse state-issued currency. When Senator Aldrich eventually presented the plan, the public saw right through it. They recognized the familiar face of the money trust. It was immediately denounced and politically dead. The bankers, however, had simply lost the first battle, not the war. They understood that to win, they needed a new political face. The 1912 election of Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who campaigned on progressive reforms and ending the banking trusts, provided the perfect camouflage. The bankers' plan needed a new name and a new sponsor. They found one in Representative Carter Glass, who was genuinely concerned with banking reform but could be guided. The new bill was titled the Federal Reserve Act. The genius of the maneuver was simple. Take the structure of the failed Aldrich Plan, add a layer of government control at the very top, the presidentially appointed Federal Reserve Board, and push it through while the public was distracted. The key debate wasn't over the fundamental power of the system, the power to create money, but over the control of the system. Should it be entirely private or partially supervised by the government? This debate was the perfect red herring. While Washington, D.C. emptied out for Christmas break, Congress held a vote. On December 23, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law by President Wilson. Many who voted for it truly believed they were creating a public institution to tame the greed of Wall Street. But what they created was a hybrid. The public facade, the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., appointed by the President. This is the part everyone sees. The private engine, the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks which are owned by the commercial banks in their district. These banks collect dividends on their stock and are the actual mechanisms of money creation and debt issuance. Senator Carter Glass himself later admitted the deception, stating that the law maintained the substance of the Aldrich Plan. But the true, world-altering significance of the Federal Reserve wasn't just its structure, it was the power it now possessed. The power of fractional reserve banking applied on a national scale, and the power to create debt-based money. The Great Depression, 1920s-1930. The Fed was founded to prevent financial panics. Yet, less than 2 decades after its creation, the United States plunged into the Great Depression, the deepest and most devastating economic collapse in history. How could this happen? The answer lies in the Fed's primary tool, the discount rate, the interest rate at which it lends money to its member banks. In the 1920s, the Fed kept interest rates artificially low. This easy money policy fueled massive speculation in the stock market, the Roaring Twenties. Historians and economists, including future Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke, largely agree. The Fed's monetary policies were instrumental in creating the speculative bubble that led to the 1929 stock market crash. But the real catastrophe came afterward. When the banking system began to implode, the Fed, the supposed lender of last resort, failed spectacularly. Instead of rushing liquidity into the system to stop the bank runs, as its charter demanded, it stood by. The money supply contracted by nearly one-third between 1930 and 1933. Banks failed in droves, wiping out the life savings of millions of Americans. Why? The prevailing theory at the time, the liquidationist view, suggested that the economy needed a painful purging of bad debts. But the unintended consequence was economic collapse. The Great Depression was not just a failure of the economy. It was a devastating, systemic failure of the newly minted central bank. The fallout from the Depression led to dramatic changes in the 1930s, ostensibly fixing the Fed's flaws. The Banking Acts of 1933 and 1935 centralized power from the 12 regional banks into the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., granting the public facade more overt authority. They also created the FDIC to ensure bank deposits, promising citizens their money was safe, regardless of a bank failure. But the most shocking move came in 1933. To stop the runs and regain control, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102, outlawing the private ownership of gold by U.S. citizens, forcing them to sell their gold to the Treasury. This severed the last direct link between the people and real money. The gold was gone, and the American financial system was now wholly reliant on the Fed's paper currency, backed only by the promise of the government. The next major chapter in the Fed's power grab came in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference. With the U.S. emerging as the world's dominant power after WTO, a new global monetary order was established. Under Bretton Woods, the world's major currencies were pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. dollar, in turn, was pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This established the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Crucially, the system allowed foreign central banks, but not private citizens, to exchange their dollars for gold at this fixed rate. For a time, this system enforced a degree of discipline on the Federal Reserve. If the Fed printed too many dollars, foreign central banks would notice the excess, demand gold, and drain the U.S. reserves. This gold standard, however tenuous, was the Fed's ultimate constraint. But that discipline was an obstacle to the massive, unchecked spending required for the Vietnam War and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. The Fed printed dollars to fund this spending, causing a trade deficit and sending too many dollars overseas. Foreign governments, particularly France, saw the writing on the wall. They began demanding gold for their excess dollars, draining the U.S. gold reserves at an alarming rate.
The system was collapsing. The choice for the U.S. government was either to undergo a politically painful deflationary recession by cutting spending and stopping the money printing, or to break the promise. They chose the latter. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon delivered a stunning televised address. Citing foreign speculators and unfair trade practices, he announced his new economic policy. Tucked away in that speech was the bombshell that changed global finance forever. President Nixon ordered the temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility to gold. This became known as the Nixo shock. 50 years later, the measure is still in place. That day, the United States abandoned the gold standard entirely. Money was no longer backed by anything tangible. It was now pure fiat currency, backed only by the decree of the government and the unlimited printing power of the Federal Reserve. The last constraint on the Fed was gone. The private bankers who engineered the system back in 1913 finally had the power they always wanted, the power to create money at will, unburdened by the cost of gold. They now had a monopoly on creation and a monopoly on debt. The modern crisis, the endless debt machine. Modern parallels and shocking data. The consequences of the Nixon shock and the Federal Reserve's ultimate liberation are not abstract. They are the single most important factor in your diminishing purchasing power and the paralyzing growth of global debt. The central concept you must understand is debt monetization. In the fiat system, the process of money creation is a three-step self-feeding loop. The government spends. The U.S. Treasury needs money it doesn't have. It issues a treasury bond, a promise to pay debt. The Fed creates. The Federal Reserve steps in, buys that bond, and pays for it with brand new money created electronically out of thin air. The debt loop. The government now has the money to spend, but it owes the Fed the principal plus interest. The Fed, using its unique authority, has simultaneously financed the government and created a profitable new asset, the interest-bearing bond, for itself and its member banks. This system guarantees perpetual national debt. Before 1913, the U.S. debt would rise during wars and fall afterward. But since 1971, the U.S. national debt has moved in only one direction, vertically. Clear chart of U.S. national debt from 1971 to present, spiking aggressively. Consider the scale of the debt explosion. In 1971, when the gold window was closed, the total U.S. national debt was around $400 billion. Today, it is in the tens of trillions. The increase is not incremental, it is exponential. The system designed at Jekyll Island, freed from the constraint of gold in 1971, has become a runaway machine. This process has two primary victims. Victim one, the taxpayer. Every dollar of new money created by the Fed to buy government debt increases the interest payments the government owes. That interest is paid by your taxes. The Federal Reserve, the entity that creates the money, is also the entity to which we, the taxpayers, owe interest. Victim two, your savings. The constant creation of new dollars, which is the definition of inflation, dilutes the value of every existing dollar. This is the hidden tax. It's not paid in April, it's paid every time the price of gas, groceries, or housing rises faster than your salary. It is the steady, systemic erosion of your purchasing power, engineered to finance government spending and prop up the banking sector. The shocking truth is that the Federal Reserve's true power is not to achieve the dual mandate of stable prices and maximum employment, which was only added to its mission decades later. Its true power and its inherent purpose is to manage the debt cycle, ensuring the banks are always profitable and the government always has a financier, regardless of the cost to the average citizen. Since 1971, the world has attempted to control this runaway financial system, but every fix has failed, only leading to more centralization of power. Take the financial crisis of 2008. The crisis was caused in part by the low interest rate environment sustained by the Federal Reserve in the early 2000s, which fueled a massive real estate bubble. When the bubble burst, the entire global financial system was on the verge of collapse. In the 1930s, the Fed was criticized for doing too little. In 2008, it did too much. To save its member banks and the global credit markets, the Fed deployed a controversial new tool, quantitative easing, or QE. This was money printing on a scale that dwarfed any previous action. They essentially bought trillions of dollars of toxic assets, including bad mortgage-backed securities, from the private banks.
This was not a loan. It was a permanent injection of liquidity that fundamentally saved the biggest financial institutions in the world. The consequences? The rich, whose assets were bought and whose institutions were saved, got richer. The middle class, who saw their savings inflated away and their wages stagnate, paid the ultimate price. This intervention confirmed the repeating pattern established in 1913. When the system is threatened, the public facade of the Fed always acts to protect the private interests of its member institutions. 1907, the crisis justified the creation of the Fed. 1929. The crisis justified centralizing the Fed's power over the money supply. 1971. The crisis justified severing the last link to gold, giving the Fed unlimited power. 2008-2020. The crises justified trillions in money creation. QE. Solid.